following up and you're not demonstrating that it's important to you, it definitely won't be important to anyone else.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Allied Advisors podcast. The podcast specifically for mid-market manufacturers looking to scale operations and improve that ever-important bottom line. Today, I'm joined by Meg Lanza. Meg is the head of technology for BSH. Meg and I go way back, all the way back to 2011 at Robert Bosch here in Charleston. I was fortunate enough to work for Meg in a lot of different capacities. And you're going to see it in this episode, but Meg's great. She's probably forgotten more about lean manufacturing than what I'm going to learn in this lifetime. So really, really lucky to have her on today. So Meg, again, thank you so much for carving out the time to be with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for the kind words.
No, it's definitely true. And anybody that's worked with you would also second that. So maybe before we get started, if you don't mind taking a few minutes and just kind of telling everybody about your background, your work history, and what you're doing now.
Mm-hmm. My background is really in industrial engineering, and that has kind of formed the foundation for my whole career. So I started out in automotive, and right out of college, I co-opted for Delphi when it was still part of General Motors. And then I went to school for ergonomics and human factors. And then when I got out of graduate school, I started working for Honda. And I worked for Honda for a year and then transferred to Bosch. And then I worked for Bosch in Charleston in the automotive division and a couple of years in the Nuremberg plant, which is also an automotive facility, for a couple of years. So overall, about 21 years in the automotive division at Bosch. And then recently, the past 4 years, I've been working for the home appliance division of Bosch, BSH. And so really a totally different type of business model. And of course, it's still manufacturing, but I'm learning a lot, and it's a very different experience.
Yeah, the one thing I tell people, if you can make it in automotive, especially tier 1 automotive manufacturing, you can make it anywhere. Like
It's not for everyone.
It is not for everybody. It is it's intense, right?
You get a little bit addicted to it, though,
You do. When you leave it, you're like, wait a minute. You don't call me at 3 a.m. and expect me to wake up and get in here and get this. What? Yeah. But that's awesome. Well, Meg, again, thanks so much for joining us. One of the things that, I got the privilege of watching you do as a director of operations and a leader is kind of align teams around common goals. A lot of what we do in our role as consultants with Allied Advisors is really try to help executive leadership teams figure out what to work on, right? So, how do you approach that? How do you do project derivation? And how do you make sure to keep those folks focused on the projects once you've selected them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is leadership, right? This is one of the fundamental responsibilities of leadership is how to figure out what do we work on. That's the job. And I wish I could give a very simple, here's what you do, 1, 2, 3 steps, and then you figure out what to work on and what not to work on. But it's of course not that simple, or anybody could do it. So I think there's different ways of getting there. You have a lot of inputs that are coming into you as a leader, as a head of an organization, and you have to analyze and assimilate those inputs and then make some decisions. But I guess my first recommendation would be what we learned from Lean is to always start with the customer requirements. So you have a global strategy coming in, maybe a corporate strategy, a regional strategy. You have top-down targets. You have market requirements. You have stakeholder requirements. You have targets, KPIs. You have a vision. All of these inputs are coming in, but I would suggest the first place to start is with those customer requirements, understanding what your customer wants and needs, and also, of course, ideally being able to predict what your customer will want or need that they may not even know they want or need at this point. And there's lots of tools to help do this. There's PESTLE, SWOT, Interested Parties Matrix. There's, different processes that you can use to analyze this information. But that's where you have to start, I believe, is with the customer.
So once you've figured out, let's say, you've done a SWOT analysis and, or you've done a value stream map and you've come up with, hey, all right, here's what we got to work on over the next 90 days, 6 months, whatever time frame you're looking at. What tools do you use to keep those folks, centered around it? Because a lot of times what I see is there's a meeting on the floor that happens, right? There's something that comes up, um, a new customer requirement or part change. We meet about it one time, and then leadership looks at their team and goes, okay, you got it, right? You got it. And then they leave and nobody ever talks about it again. And then when leadership comes back, in 6 months, they're like, well, wait a minute, I thought you had it, right? So how do you go about keeping those folks focused on these projects so that you actually do see the results?
I mean, I think you just described the problem. One is setting clear expectations, and two is following up. So you have to set some level of accountability. If you're not following up and you're not demonstrating that it's important to you, it definitely won't be important to anyone else. Everyone has a lot of things on their plate, a lot of balls to juggle, and you have to, as the leader, set the tone for this is the most important one, or this is one of the most important ones. And then you have to demonstrate that by following up on it. So if you set some kind of standard, this in your organization and you let it slide, you no longer have a standard. So we always use the example of, if you've got a kid and bedtime is 8 o'clock and you say, 5 minutes, it's okay. We'll let them stay up till 8:05 tonight. And then the next night it's 8:10 and the next night it's 8:15. Well, your standard's gone. Your bedtime is no longer 8 o'clock. So this is the same way. If you're going to set a standard, if you're going to set an expectation, but you're not going to follow through with it, and make the organization understand its importance, then it won't be. So it's your responsible as a leader to follow through. And then also, when your team does focus on something and get some results, it's your job to provide feedback on those results. So, hey, as a result of what you did here, we got new business, or we saved a lot of money that's going to allow us to invest in some new equipment or some new research. We got great customer feedback. So now they're going to continue buying from us. And also just to show appreciation when the things that you are setting the expectation for is getting done and is getting done successfully, to show appreciation and recognition for those things.
Um, so now that we've kind of talked about how do you figure out the projects, how do you hold people accountable, how do you follow up? One of the things that I see, from time to time with teams is how do you keep these folks from getting burned out, right? Because especially in these mid-market manufacturers, the guy who's doing the project is the same guy who's out there, running the shop floor. So how do you position your teams and how do you manage so that you give folks time to be successful in the projects, while still, allowing them, not to get burned out?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you have to evaluate your resources and your capacity to work on different topics. Once you've decided what's really important, um, you can only pick the things that you have the people to work on. So if you have too many things, then you're necessarily going to run into trouble. But sometimes I even see teams that have less resources be more effective because they are more willing to reject like a silo thinking, and the lines are a little more blurred and you don't hear like, no, that's not my job as much. And they're willing to kind of be more flexible in the roles they take on across the organization. So it's not necessarily specific to the number of people you have, but um, by all means, you have to set realistic targets. So we always say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And that's really important, that you can break projects and activities up into chunks, manageable chunks, so that they can get done, rather than setting, a target a year from now and then expecting that to go very smoothly, because we are all in super dynamic environments and things are going to change, and the conditions are going to change, and what we need to work on, the problems that come up. So we have to allow for a little bit of flexibility in our timelines when necessary, but we have to, kind of set up our projects so that we're working in quick cycles, setting short-term goals. One thing I learned when I was studying human factors and ergonomics is that to avoid musculoskeletal injuries from repetitive work, it's more effective to work with micro breaks. So, meaning you take frequent short rest cycles, not work for a really long time and then take a longer break. No, you work for a short time, take a very short break, take a short time, short break. So that was more effective in preventing musculoskeletal injuries. So it's the same with mental burnout. Let's work in small chunks and then evaluate. Where are we? Where do we need to go? Set those short-term goals. And in the past, I've worked in a lot of environments where we do it in 3-month cycles. So what are we going to do for the next 3 months? And then, the next quarter, okay, where did we get to? Did we get to where we said we were going to? If not, why not? Are we still on track? Reevaluate and then set up the next 3 months. So I think that really helps a lot, rather than making these massive project timelines that are very difficult to adhere to. Um, and then, maybe also not falling into the trap of saying, well, we're too busy to improve. You've probably seen the diagrams or the pictures of, like, there's one kind of well-known one where there's some guys pushing a car with square wheels, and someone's standing by the side of the road holding a round tire, and they're like, nope, sorry, we can't stop, we're too busy to improve. And obviously stopping would make the work go much faster. So we have to be careful not to fall into that trap as well. And I think something that you and Blair talked about, a couple weeks ago, it applies here as well. How can I split up the day to day and the improvement work? So maybe it's not realistic to pile all the improvement work on someone who's responsible for all the day to day, or maybe you have to get them help. How do we divide that work up? Um, that's a question that needs to be answered. But really, if you build a team, this goes back to your hiring decisions. It goes back to how you select which people will do which work. But if you want to pick people that are excited, they're passionate, they're disruptors, they're hungry, they're curious, they want to experiment, take risks, and they're self-motivated. They're okay with pushing out of their comfort zone. If you get some people like that, um, then they want this. They want to drive change in the organization. If you have people that are very uncomfortable with change, then they're going to burn out, because this is not what a good fit for them. So it's really important who you pick to do which type of work.
You said so much right there that I want to dive into. Like the first one, oh man, hiring the right people, right? Hiring folks that want to drive change, that want to make improvements. That is so critical. When you're interviewing, making sure that you get the right people on the team, that get excited about your vision, right? Get excited about changing the status quo and making improvements, because not everybody is that person, right? And the world needs all types, but when we're trying to make transformational change in an organization, we definitely need the type of person who is excited about it.
It's almost the first thing I look for now in interviews, even more so than the technical criteria, is like, what makes you want to come into work every day? What gets you out of bed in the morning? I want to know what gets people moving and what motivates them, because you need to have those people on your team. You need to be able to motivate them to get this type of work done. It's very challenging, but if they're on board and this is what they enjoy doing, then you can be very successful.
I think too many people get bogged down on their technical expertise. And I think the same thing. I'm like, I don't care if you're an expert industrial engineer. I can teach you how to be an expert industrial engineer. I need you to be excited about learning. I need you to be excited about making changes. I need you to be excited about coming to work every day. The rest of it, we can figure out, right? I mean, we're not,
for the most part, I mean, exceptions, but yes, for the most part, there are competencies that we can teach, and then competencies that are a little harder to teach. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, if you're building nuclear bombs or something, yeah, you might want a nuclear physicist for that. I get it. Mm-hmm. But for improving manufacturing, I think attitude is probably more important. And then you talked about, short improvement cycles. I do think that's so important. That we always do 90-day sprints, right? I mean, and I learned that from you and the folks at Bosch. Those 90-day continuous improvement cycles, I really do think that's the sweet spot for me. Maybe I'm biased because of my history, but I think that's really it. And then talking about being smart about what you choose to work on, I think that's a part that gets missed by a lot of mid-market executives. Is they think if they push hard and they tell somebody, yeah, I know it's a 90-day project, but I want you to do it in 5 weeks, that's better. And it's not. But to me, what I see happen is the person who's responsible for doing it looks at it and goes, well, that's never going to happen, so I'm not worried about any of it, right? And then you just killed their morale. You killed their drive, right? I mean, it's almost like a cancer, and it just spreads to the entire organization. Instead of being smart and realistic and saying, hey, I'm going to give you a 90-day project. It is a 90-day project. Now, you have to work for 90 days, but it's doable in 90 days. and I'm going to hold you accountable to doing it in 90 days, they try to make it, I don't know, superhuman or something. And it's just way worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important as a leader to be realistic and to understand how long the lead time for a certain project is. And if it's that urgent and that critical, then you might need to say, put this other thing aside and only focus on this, but add this to everything else you're working on, assuming that we're not leaving our people with lots of free capacity, just
Mm-hmm.
waiting for an emergency to come up. Yeah, I mean, something's going to have to give. And that's part of our job as leaders to help our associates prioritize, help our teams prioritize, and understand what needs to be done first.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on it, but my next question was going to be, what type of leadership behaviors do you look for in good leaders, right? Because to your point, when we're assigning work, we really kind of have to have our finger on the pulse and understand what's the current workload, where does this fit? Because you always get, oh, I'm too busy, I'm too busy, I'm too busy, and oftentimes that can be true, and sometimes it's like, yeah, you're busy, but are you working on the right things, and are you doing it in the best way possible, right? How can we? There's probably some hidden capacity there that you're not seeing. But how do you as a leader, what type of leadership behaviors do you see or do you expect to see from good leaders that know how to manage these types of challenges?
I mean, I think there's a couple things. When we're talking about manufacturing specifically, um, a good leader has to know that the value is added on the shop floor and they have to be present on the shop floor. So it's not just about going out to the floor and doing a quick lap and being like, okay, I got my shop floor time in for today, but it's knowing what to do when you get there and knowing what to look for. And we used to teach a class at Bosch called TPS for Executives that was developed by the BAMA organization, which is a Toyota supplier support network. And one of the things we talked about in that class was exactly that. What do I look for? And the things that you look for are like, for different processes, can I tell, am I winning or losing on this process right now? Am I where I'm supposed to be? Is my output where it's supposed to be for this time of the shift? Do I have the right amount of inventory at this station, and so on? And then, can I tell? Can I observe a repeated pattern where people are doing the same work? I can tell who's supposed to be doing what. Or is it sometimes somebody's doing this and then the next time somebody else is doing it and people are just kind of moving around and working and keeping busy, but it's really not clear who's supposed to be doing what. So you're looking for things like that. You're looking for triggers. Hey, how did that person know to move that box at that time? How did they know to change over the line at this point? What are those connections on the shop floor that should be taking place and should have a standardized approach? And you're looking just, at the standards. Are we maintaining our 5S? Is the environment safe? Things like this. But you should kind of, as a leader, know what you want to look for when you go out there. So you're not just walking around. It's not just showing your face. It's actually, looking to see if the floor is running the way that you want it to be. And also engaging when you're out with your teams. Engaging with people on a personal level. So, interacting, getting to know people, it can take you so far. Just building the trust in the organization and getting people's kind of loyalty and commitment is just, hey, how are you? How was your vacation? I remember your son got married. How was that? Just those little personal touches. It really means a lot to people, and it makes them feel like they're in an environment where the organization cares about more than just how many pieces we got out today.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that's one thing. Another thing I think is the ability to set clear expectations and then hold the team accountable to them and to respond to problems in a standardized way. And also to have the humility to understand that most problems have a technical root cause and they also have a management root cause. And there's a very high probability that leadership issues are contributing to this problem. There's some system that's not in place that is a responsibility of leadership that we have to fix. It's not just a technical root cause, and it's not just someone being careless or someone making a mistake. That's happening as a result of something bigger. And we have to be humble enough to say, Let's look at the whole picture here and see what's possibly going wrong. Also, I would say a sense of urgency. I'm not talking about hysteria. I'm not talking about panic. I'm not talking about, losing it when something doesn't go the way that you want it to, or progress isn't, as fast as you'd like. I'm talking about how do we convey to our teams, again, what is important and what needs to be done by when, and then holding the teams accountable to those deliverables. But, especially when it comes to something like safety, like my expectation is if I observe a safety problem on the shop floor and I bring it to your attention, you're going to work on that right now. Like that's not something to put on your list for the next couple of weeks. Like we're going to fix that. So just setting those expectations and instilling that sense of urgency that when we identify problems, we need to start figuring out right away how to fix them
Mm-hmm.
within
Yeah,
the
I mean,
context again of what's important, what's the most important things.
yeah, I mean, I love what you talked about, and I think Blair and I touched on this too, about going out to the shop floor. Right? Leaders need to be present on the shop floor, and they need to be engaged in the continuous improvement. They need to understand the processes. They don't have to be the technical expert, but they need to have a pretty good understanding of what's going on out there. Otherwise, leading from the office is not something you can do in manufacturing, right? You got to be out on the shop. 100%, 100%. So I love hearing you say that. And then, you talk about sense of urgency and a standardized way of solving a problem. How do you, when there are problems, right? Let's say you have a line down situation, machine, robot crash, you know, we talked in the pre-meeting about swarming that problem, about bringing everybody together to get this thing resolved. How do you approach that? Because I think that in a lot of mid-market manufacturers, they don't have that standard in their toolbox for when issues happen, right? So line goes down, somebody gets notified, they talk about it the next morning in the meeting, but there's not like oh my goodness, line's down, we've got to get this thing going now. How do you approach that swarm, the
Mhm.
swarm? What does that look like to you?
I mean, this is something else that we learned from our relationship with Bama. So when there's a problem, it depends on who you're going to call, but you need the experts. So depending on what kind of problem it is, whoever the experts are with respect to that problem, you need them there. And that's typically a cross-functional team. And of course, your first priority is to contain the problem. And that's everyone's, first priority. At the same time, you want to be performing that crime scene analysis. So that's
Mm-hmm.
the purpose of the swarm. Get the people there to document the conditions under which this problem happened. So while it's fresh. So which station, which line, which operator, which shift, which variant, et cetera. You want which tool, you want all of those things to be documented so that you can understand that the is not, what is happening, what is not happening. And then you have to start that problem solving process. So you want your goal is to find and countermeasure the root cause to eliminate this problem permanently. And so you start this process of short cycle problem solving. We keep talking about short cycles. Everything isn't necessarily a long project, but testing your hypothesis. Okay, I think this might be the root cause. Can I turn the problem on and off by manipulating this variable? And start experimenting. So that's you're successful if your team is learning and you're getting closer to root cause.
Go ahead. No, you're good.
I'm talking too much.
No, this is great. I'm actually letting you talk. I listen to some episodes and I'm out here just spouting off at the mouth, and I'm like, nobody wants to hear what I got to say. That's why you have a guest, Justin. Shut up and let me talk. So thank you. No, no, but I think, I can remember back in my Bosch days, at the time I was responsible for warehouse operations, specifically packaging delivery. And I can remember the line going down for a packaging issue, and the director of manufacturing for that particular product line coming to me and saying, "Hey, I want you and I
Yes.
want the engineers responsible in this room, and I don't want anybody to leave until my line's back up and running, and you've got a root cause identified and a corrective action as to what you're
Mhm.
going to do to prevent this from happening again." Um, and
It might
and we
seem
did.
dramatic, but honestly, once you get used to it, once it's practice, you start getting better and better at it. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
I know what data to collect. I know what questions to ask. I know how this works.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't always have to be a big dramatic event. You get better at it the more that you do it. And the more that it just becomes, this is how we work.
I mean,
You know,
what we did at that case, and maybe I should have also included this. Bosch had a tool at the time they called a problem definition and solving sheet. So we wrote, number one, we got the line back up and running. So that was the first thing we did. Number two, we sat down and completed the PDSS, right? And we presented it to him and said, hey, here's the root cause, here's what we're gonna do, here's the corrective actions. This is when it will be done by. And he said, great, thanks, Justin. See you later. Right? And that was it. Like, it wasn't, to your point, it wasn't some big dramatic thing. It was just,
it's a
this.
standardized approach to
Correct.
a problem. Yeah.
Correct. And it was a sense of urgency, right? We can't be shutting the line down. It's important that this thing runs. So no, it was but I think about that all the time. Like, hey, you know, I'm in places and the line goes down, and it might be down weeks or days, and everybody's like, line's down, no worries, we'll start back Monday. Like, man, that is very different than the life I lived in automotive.
It's just, and maybe it isn't so important. Maybe that line can afford to be down for 2 days, but the mindset you're instilling is leaning towards complacency there.
Yeah.
So then the line starts to become very unclear of, when do I react with urgency and when don't I? So you kind of always have to be pushing that. Again, this isn't panic, this isn't hysteria, but we know what to do.
Right.
Do we have a standardized approach? Let's execute it when we have the problem that happens.
Yeah, it's not panic or hysteria, but there's expectations.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the one thing I always felt like good manufacturing companies have clear expectations, and everybody knows what they are, and they govern themselves accordingly. They don't change, right? They stay the same, but having them set and having them understood by everybody, you just able to you react, right? And the results you get show it. So yeah, I think that's
It's
super
standard
important.
managing using standards, and yes, standards can change for sure.
They should.
But if they do, then everyone has to understand what the change is and, live that change.
Yeah. So speaking of standards, we talked about when we have problems, swarming the problem, getting all the experts together on the shop floor. But when you're not in a firefighting or in a crisis mode, when it's just your normal daily operations, what daily leadership routines are you trying to put in place to make sure that we're not getting into that crisis mode, right? That we're able to detect issues, before they become a big problem, and then restore that process back to standard. How do you approach daily leadership routine, or DLR for
Yeah.
an acronym?
I think most companies that I've visited or been exposed to have some form of a morning meeting or a start of shift meeting, or what we might call daily leadership routines. So again, this is daily. It's typically a review of what problems occurred the previous shift or the previous day, and are those problems contained, and what do we need to do to solve them permanently. So we're going through this review of the issues. The traps I've seen with this are, one, that it's a giant OPL, open points list collection, and that we're doing it on a computer, and we're coming up with this very lengthy list of things that need to be done and actions that need to be taken, and then they are lost in this file somewhere, and we end up with a list of things with due dates that are not closed. So that's one trap I think we can fall into it with it. And the other trap, I think, is trying to identify and record every single deviation we experience, which is totally overwhelming to the organization. So a couple things that I've seen that work very well are, one, being very clear about defining which deviations are causing us the most problems right now, and therefore these are the ones that we're going to react to. So it's fallout on this station, or it's downtime on that process, or whatever it is, and we're setting trigger limits. So if fallout goes above X pieces per hour, or if the machine is down for more than 3 minutes, or whatever it is, we're setting those limits, and that's what we're reacting to. And then those are the problems that we're trying to solve. And then as we solve those problems, we come up with new deviations and new target limits that we're reacting to. So that just keeps it manageable for the organization. It also allows us to drive the problem solving down as deep as possible into the organization. So if I'm a team leader or production supervisor, I can very easily react. If the cycle time of this process is supposed to be 60 seconds and all day we've been running at 70, I can see that, I can observe that, and that's something I can react to.
Mm-hmm.
And then the things that we observe that we cannot solve in those meetings with our production associates and production leadership, then we can push those up to higher levels in the organization. If it's something more serious, more significant, that's going to take more resources and more time to solve. The other thing that I've seen with this process that works very well, and a lot of people balk at this because it seems like more work, is instead of managing this process electronically, to manage it using cards, like Kanban cards, basically. So, I found a deviation today. I'm going to write down the action item for that. I'm going to assign a person in the meeting, and I'm going to hand them that card physically. This is symbolic, me handing this responsibility to you. You are accepting the card, accepting the responsibility, and you are defining the due date by which this action will be done, and you are placing it on a board where everyone can see, okay, this is, I'm going to address this in the next 3 days. And then in 3 days, we can take the card off the board from that date and say, okay, today is the day that you said this would be complete. What's been done? What's the fix or whatever? But just to, really drive accountability and make it transparent as to what kind of corrective actions are going on. I've seen that work quite well.
In our pre-meeting, you talked about, I think an example you saw somewhere where there was actually 3 different layers of the daily leadership routine. So
Yeah.
maybe can you talk to that? Because I thought that was really cool. I've never seen that done, but I think I could see where it would work really well.
So maybe there's a level 1 where you're working with the team leader on the shop floor, and with the team, with the production team, or specific members of the production team. And then level 2, you're working more with maybe the production supervisor, let's say, or group leader, and maybe an engineer or maintenance. You're pulling in some more people. Maybe it's a little more cross-functional at that point. And then the level 3 would be where you're bringing in like the value stream leader and the management level. But everything that's being talked about at level 1 does not need to be talked about at level 3, because that team has the autonomy and is empowered to solve those problems themselves and never pass it on. So ideally, you'd have a bunch of deviations, in the level 1, and those don't get passed on. They don't all get passed on to the level 2. Only the ones that need to be, that can't be solved at that level, would get passed on.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that bubbling up to the different levels of the organization. If you could get that, to a mature state where the level 1 is capable of solving these problems, so that they don't all bubble up to level 3, I can definitely see where that would really be an effective way of driving problem solving. And at the very least, it helps leadership stay in tune with what are the big roadblocks that are being experienced every day by my shop floor team. So I could definitely see where that would be beneficial.
And if it's not a big organization, maybe you don't need 3 levels. That was just an example. Maybe you use 2 levels, it's pretty flexible.
Yeah, and I like what you talked about with having the right KPIs and only reacting when you see deviations, to established limits. I see that a lot of times in different organizations with their daily leadership routine. They may have KPIs that they're tracking for safety, quality, cost, delivery, but there's really no standardized reaction, right? There may not even be limits set, but if there are, there's no like, okay, well, we didn't hit our target. What are we doing? Are we deviated below our acceptable threshold? What are we doing? There's really no standardized reaction there. I think that's a huge thing.
Well, and that's a good point too. So when we have the different levels of DLR, at the first level, you're identifying those deviations that are clear to that shop floor team. So if I'm tracking deviations to productivity or OEE at that level, that is not helpful for those associates. they can't solve those problems. But maybe when you get to the higher level DLR, they are looking at those,
Mm-hmm.
the higher level KPIs. So from a KPI tree perspective, the lowest KPIs on the KPI tree are the ones that are being addressed in the DLR1. And as you move up the KPI tree, those higher level KPIs are being addressed at the higher level DLRs.
Yeah, that's another. I mean, so for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with that term, a KPI tree is just a visual representation of the natural hierarchy of KPIs within the organization, right? So to Meg's point, OEE or productivity, those are calculations, those are ratios, and those are comprised of a lot of things at lower levels that go into that, right? So, OEE, for example, if we build, a lot of bad quality parts, right? That's going to affect my OEE, but that's not immediately apparent if I'm just looking at the result, right? I have to dig down into that to figure out what am I looking at. So in terms of levels of that DLR, level 1 might be how many bad parts have I built this hour? And if I go above a threshold, then I'm pulling an andon, I'm getting somebody out here, we're figuring that out. Um, and then if I'm unable to figure it out and it continues to mount, then it's going to build up to my level 3 because my OEE is going to take a dip, right? So, understanding, and I think that's critical too, understanding your KPIs, how they relate to one another, and what levers you can pull to impact each KPI. That's something that's not very well understood, especially at small to mid-market manufacturers. And I would tell anybody listening to this, if you don't really understand what we're talking about here, look it up, right? You really need to take the time to dig into that, because a KPI tree is one of the most critical tools, I think, in a lean toolbox. It should be directing everything you're working on. I think back, there was a manufacturing director at Bosch, and we used to go to him every quarter with our projects that we were working on, and we would meet and talk about this for hours, and then I would present it to him, and he'd be like, "Justin, I mean, these are great, I guess. I don't know why you're working on them," and he'd leave, and I always felt so deflated. I'm like, "Dang it, why is he not as excited about this as I am?" And I went to him and I was like, you know, "Tell me, why are you, what is up? What can I do to make this better?" And he said, "I pay yours and everybody on your team that supports me, I pay their salary. You're a cost center, I'm a profit center. I don't understand what value I'm getting for these projects. What KPIs of mine are you impacting? I don't understand. You haven't communicated that to me." I was like, "Oh." So if I put together a KPI tree that showed you how what I'm working on impacts your KPIs, that would make it, that would work for you. And he was like, "Yes, I would love to see that." So we did that. That was one of our projects that quarter, was we were putting together a KPI tree, and then the next quarter we automated it. But when I met with him the next quarter and I was able to show him, "Here are the KPIs we're missing, John. This is why we're going to work on them, and this is what the impact's going to be." He was like, "Oh, great. Thanks. Appreciate it, Justin." I mean, it's just being able to explain it and understanding why we're working on it was a big deal. And I've never forgot that. I've always remembered it. And it's, I always try to tell people, understand why you're working on it. What impact are you going to have? So,
But we talked
yeah,
about resources before, and
yeah.
to make good decisions about how you're using your resources, you need to understand the impact of the projects that they're working on.
So shout out to John Kraus. Really appreciate that. It's been a lifelong professional lesson. So thank you. I've carried it with me. So anyway, all right. Meg, I think that was, I'm just sitting here checking my sheet. I think that was all of the main questions I had for you today. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you're like, "Hey, Justin, if I could tell you one thing, or if I could tell anybody out there one thing that I think really makes a difference in this lean journey, it would be X."
I mean, for me, I just think the biggest mistake I made when I started is I wanted everything all at once. And I really pushed for the ideal state. And if I can go back, just to take those baby steps, don't underestimate the power of those small improvements and those small steps. That's really, to me, you'll get there. You'll get to the big payoff. But
Mm-hmm.
it does take time. You have to have a little bit of patience. You gotta temper that sense of urgency with a little bit of patience to see the results. But if you're steadily going forward, you're steadily taking those baby steps, then you will get there.
Again, Meg, thanks so much for taking the time. I know you're super busy, so really appreciate you carving an hour out of your day to sit down and talk with us. Thanks again.
No problem. Thank you for asking me.